Week 16 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few running backs I will bench this week, and in time filming this video here, none of these guys have been placed on the COVID list or out. The first guy I would bench this week here is Rashaad Penny of the Seattle Seahawks. So Penny a couple weeks ago had a huge ball game versus the Houston Texans, and then last week in a big spot for a lot of fantasy owners at the Rams. He didn't do anything in that ball game. And this week, I know it's a decent matchup versus the Chicago Bears, but we just saw the Chicago Bears pretty much limit Dalvin Cook in that ball game on Monday Night Football. So the last few games here for Penny, Week 13 versus San Francisco, 10 carries, 35 yards, a catch for 27. Week 14 at Houston, he had the monster game, 16 carries, 137 rush yards, 2 touchdowns, a catch for a yard. And then last week in that sloppy Tuesday Night Football game at the Rams, 11 carries, 39 rush yards, and 2 catches for 5 yards. So right here this week, not a great matchup for Chicago. Like I mentioned, they just shut down Dalvin Cook for the most part. And in a big situation here in your semifinals game, I know if you have Rashaad Penny and no other options, you're going to start him. But if you got better options than Penny, I would definitely go the other way here and bench Penny this week. The next guy is Chase Edmonds of the Arizona Cardinals. So Chase Edmonds here, he came back from injury finally in last week's ball game, Week 15 at Detroit. After missing 5 ball games here was Edmonds. So in that game at Detroit, he didn't do much. 6 carries, still had 53 yards, so good yards per carry. But that ball game got out of hand early and often, where Arizona was trailing quickly in that game by 10 points to a touchdown. And they abandoned the run, even though we thought Chase Edmonds this season will be a good receiver out of the backfield. For the most part, that hasn't been the case here. And anyway, James Conner, in my opinion, is the better running back, and he should be the guy that they work through here in Arizona. And this week on paper, it's a Saturday night ball game versus Indianapolis that gives up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to running back. So with James Conner, the better back over there in Arizona, with Edmonds not really getting a big workload last week in his return, and even in a game that favored his game script and catching out of the backfield, and him only getting 7 touches, he's just a running back I can't trust with volume this week here, and a guy I would stay away from and bench. The next running back I would bench is Damien Harris of the New England Patriots. I know a few weeks ago he had that big ball game with Harris versus the Buffalo Bills, and he's banged up with the hamstring injury. But if it's him or Stevenson, whichever running back starts this week, I'm just not going to trust him and start him. The Bills give up the 9th least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season, and this hamstring injury is a nagging one, no doubt about it here for Harris, where he had a couple weeks to rest and it still didn't heal. Week 14 he had the bye to rest, and last week he sat out at Indianapolis. Here is Damien Harris. So right here this week, tough matchup versus Buffalo, like I mentioned, even though he had a good ball game at Buffalo in Week 13 before he went down with 10 carries, 111 yards and a touchdown. But this week here with the hamstring injury nagging, still a tough matchup. Buffalo going to play it different, I think, in this game. And the winds aren't going to be 50 miles per hour where they're going to pound the ball all game here is New England. I think Harris is a guy you just can't trust in a big situation, injured or not, with a tough matchup. And I would bench him this week. The next running back's Myles Gaskin of the Miami Dolphins. So Gaskin last week, he did come back after he was on the COVID list, but Duke Johnson had a huge ball game, getting more touches than Gaskin. It's not like Gaskin sat out the whole game and didn't get touches. They just preferred Duke Johnson, who was 100% healthy, where Gaskin was still a little fatigued coming off the COVID list, where he had 10 carries for 54 yards, good 5.4 yards per carry here. But with Duke Johnson having that monster game, in my opinion, both these guys are going to get work. And when it's a two-headed running back committee, it's usually not a good thing, especially with a tough matchup at the New Orleans Saints that give up the 2nd least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. And the last few games here for Myles Gaskin, it hasn't been anything great really, except the Week 12 game versus Carolina. 16 carries, 49 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 catches, 3 yards. Week 13 versus the Giants, 15 carries, 44 yards, 2 catches, 5 yards. And Week 15 versus the Jets, like I mentioned, 10 carries, 54 yards. But with Duke Johnson in the mix now in a tough matchup, I would steer clear here from Gaskin because he's been inconsistent as well this season. And now with another factor thrown in there with Johnson, I would just bench him this week. In the 5th and final running back I would bench is Devonta Freeman of the Baltimore Ravens. So Freeman, he's been a good find this season here for this Raven team with all the injuries at running back to J.K. Dobbins, to Gus Edwards, and to Latavius Murray really not producing this year. Freeman's been a nice sign-on here, like I mentioned, for Baltimore. The last few weeks for him, Week 13 at Pittsburgh, 14 carries, 52 yards a touch, 5 catches, 45 yards. Week 14 at the Cleveland Browns, 13 carries, 64 yards, 5 catches, 8 yards. And then last week versus Green Bay, only 6 carries, 22 yards, a catch for 2 yards. So right here, a good matchup on paper, Week 16 at Cincinnati. That gives up the 12th most fantasy points to running backs. And going back into the Week 7 game, Freeman, he had 12.90 fantasy points, 4 carries, 14 yards, a touchdown, and 3 catches, 25 yards in PPR leagues. But this week here, I don't know if Jackson's going to play. He was sidelined Wednesday still with the ankle injury. But Huntley, no doubt about it, looked like he could be a starting quarterback in this league. And hey, he got his team down the field with a chance to go to overtime. But Jim Harbaugh decided once again like a bonehead to go for 2. But that's a story for another day. But right here, I don't think Freeman does much at Cincinnati. Cincinnati in this game, if Huntley is the starter, they're going to make him try to beat him this week here. In the last few weeks, they've been pretty stout versus the run as well, Cincinnati, after having a good game versus Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams as well last week. So that's a few running backs I will bench in Week 16 of the fantasy football season.